Alrighty, what is going on, traders? Welcome back. August is in the books. I'm filming this on September 4th, and so, of course, we are going to recap and review my August. I talked about it on Twitter very briefly, but this kind of outcome was somewhat to be expected. A little bit disappointing because it didn't have to be that, and we'll talk about that if I just had avoided some big losses. This actually would have been quite a great month, arguably probably one of my better Augusts of my career. Right, last August was pretty low as well. Again, also a low August in 2021. So far, I think my best August ever is 2020 at 67,000 roughly. Then we go to 2019 where I wasn't making much at the time, and even 2018, which is actually $4,000 there. But anyways, yeah, it could have been a really good month, and it just wasn't. But again, that was to be expected. Most of my Augusts are not great. This is just a little bit disappointing because, like I said, it could have been, and we'll talk about that. But before I jump in, I just want to briefly recap what on earth happened in August. I just got back a couple days ago from Clover's Trading's boot camp in Boston. Incredible time. We traded these 2 days together, so we'll go over a trade or two from these 2 days. But just an awesome time. I'm always amped after we do one of these things. I think so are the people who go as well, especially if you've never been to one before. It makes or reminds me why I teach, which is like how rewarding it is to see a community of people kind of come together and just talk about trading, because usually most people don't have anything to talk about or anyone to talk about trading with. And so for them to go and then meet 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 plus different traders who they can talk about and share their experiences with. On top of that, learn from each other and learn from us being the speakers of the whole thing. It was an amazing time, and I can't wait for the next one, which I believe should be coming up in the Q1 of 2024. So stay tuned for that if you did not have a chance to make it to this one. But anyways, let's jump right in. Let's jump to the 1st of August, this first week here specifically, because the first, obviously with a negative 14 grand day, was not a great start. So what on earth happened? So on TUP here, this was a really great runner, right? We were running into the end of July. It seems like every 2 green days of run, there's then a small red day and then a breakout. 2 more green days of run, the small red day, then a breakout. And so, unfortunately, on this top day, August 1st, for whatever reason, I decided to ignore this pattern of 2 green days and a red day. I thought to myself that this might just collapse and die without needing 2 red days or 2 green days in a row. And that was a mistake. And ultimately, it led to a ton of slippage. And so if we go into August 1st here, let's do the custom date, August 1st. I essentially chopped myself up. Or not chopped myself up, I should say. I essentially, again, forgot of that pattern that it needs 2 green days in a row. And I had thought this was going to gap and then crap itself down to red-green. The reason why this loss was ended up being so big is because I did take a lot of slippage. And if we look at the chart here, here we go. I literally call it TUP slippage. So what happens here is I get short after it kind of craps itself, huge morning spike stuff, right? If we look at the actual intraday, right, we had a huge spike, stuff, and then another wick, and then stuff. And so at that point, I'm like getting full size, right? I kind of start in, and I add some more on that with that huge fake out. And I'm thinking this is going to fade to at least red-green. I believe red-green at the time was, where was it? It was probably, fortunately, not yesterday's data. I got to go back. But it was the mid to low 4s. So I only wanted a little bit more of a washout. Of course, we did not get it, and then it came back. And unfortunately, when I added here, I said, okay, I can risk this last attempt high, which is like 520-ish. Unfortunately, I also knew in the back of my head, like, that really wasn't the risk level to play off of. I really should be risking off this level, which I eventually changed it to. The problem is I didn't change my size, right? It's okay to change your plan, I guess, in terms of picking a better risk level, but if you do, the size you take should also be in accordance to how much you're willing to lose. And for me, it wasn't. I just had moved my risk stuff without really realizing what my size was. And so when it spiked and then broke this level, I said, nope, we're going to stick to the level that matters. And of course, a little less than a minute later, just the spike was too strong. It just blew right off both levels within a minute or two, and I cut my loss pretty much for about double what it should have been. Should have lost like 6 grand or so. I ended up losing like 14 or so. So more slippage than I wanted. Granted, you can arguably call it not slippage at all because, again, this level was the level I wanted to cut off of. The problem was not downsizing to my wider risk level. Again, mainly because I just knew this level wasn't that meaningful. But at the same time, once this action kind of came back, I also knew in the back of my head, I'm like, this is not weak, right? And it's almost like my subconscious was telling me about the pattern of, this needs 2 green days to run, and I was kind of ignoring it. Ultimately, I wish it didn't happen. I wish I just had to just cut it or even downsize sooner here if I was going to increase my risk level, like I said. So not a great start, and then I tried to short late day because there was a negative article, but decided to cover it. Just didn't think it was worth the risk overnight. Unfortunately, it ended up actually being worth the risk overnight. It had gapped down, which will go into the next trade. So if you look the next day, if we go back to the daily, it actually did gap down, right? It gapped down really nicely. So it closed at 530, 540, gap down all the way to open up at 460. So quite the large gap. Not my favorite for those who know how I like to trade, I guess overextended gap downs. The answer is I don't. I really don't like them because the risk reward kind of skews itself by how much it gaps down. A lot of times where they gap down to is where I'd want to be covering, not where I want to be shorting. But if we look in the intraday there, this is the next trade on the next day of the August 2nd right here. So, right, previous day close is 530, 540. We immediately panic out pre-market and then bounce around, slowly fade once we get to the opening price. Ultimately, I come to the conclusion that if it's not going to morning spike, I still think there's enough downside to make it worth it. I just have to find a better risk level, right? I can't get short here risking red green, which is a full, call it 60, 70 cents away. I have to pick some lower level to get some kind of better risk reward. And so that's what ultimately ended up happening if we get this trade here. So once it failed to morning spike, right, I didn't touch on this morning panic because I thought if it's going to panic straight out the open, there's no way I can just get short the first minute and risk that opening high. It's too easy, and there's a lot of overextended gap down plays that will just have a slight pull and then ramp back up to, let's say, 5. And if I wanted to get short at ideal price, it would have been 5, right? I would love to get short around 5, risking the red green at 530, and then get a final pull and flush. So I didn't want to touch it out the open. Once it had this morning spike here, and then broke high day by what? This is high day of 460s. It went to 468. So literally 5 to 6 cents of new highs, and then immediately failed. At that point, I knew that this was way weaker. And even though I don't like that it's gapping down so much, the reality is the amount of sell-off this could have even lower is still pretty high. And so that's why you do see me starting to get short on the backside of this bounce, or of that spike, I should say, into these bounces. And then I ended up being right? My thesis is my thinking behind the fact that if this couldn't spike higher, considering how overextended it was, right? If we just go to the daily chart again one more time, even though it's gapping down to 460, the reality is the last breakout level was 375, and even then it's only a 2-day breakout. The reality is this could easily, this is still up from 50 cents, and we're at 465. So I had a feeling there was still a lot of downside left in this thing, and so that's ultimately why I changed my thesis. Normally, I wouldn't even short it at all. I'd be like, nope, I need to spike or I'm not going to touch it. I did try to adapt here, and it worked out, right? It ended up covering it into these dips. Ended up actually going lower late day and even into after hours, but I'm happy with this trade I took on it. Ended up making $7,000 or so. So to lose 13 and then make 7, unfortunately I'm down on it between the last 2 days here, the top. However, if you watch my July recap, I did make a little good money on the run up leading up to these 2 days. Haven't touched it since. They put out after hours a couple days later about their restructuring their debt, which squeezed a lot of short sellers who were swinging it. But had you actually shorted that news, you would have been up nicely, right? We've pulled back even, call it 50, 60% since then, but I have not touched it since. So that's that. Not too much eventful other than that. I think another big play I had on the second was PayPal. I know a lot of people who are swinging this because this is just really good value play and it's really undervalued. But the reality is I haven't touched it since then. I pretty much longed it, and this is really out of my wheelhouse. This is not like a day trade or a strategy I trade. I just decided to give it a go, and it actually worked. I remember longing it in the low 60s, all the way to 76, but then announced earnings and it was negative, so I sold in after hours at $70. Made a few grand there. I haven't rebought because again, it's not really my type of play. Although it does look good. Actually, it looks like it's going to redo the same kind of move. It looks like it's literally just going to maybe make the same bounce back to the 70s, but probably not going to touch it. Again, that was more of a value investing play, which again is not something I'm insanely profitable with at all. PayPal was really the first attempt I had at it, and it worked. So, for terms of a learning curves perspective, that was not a great start. Usually, learning curves you want to start out a little bit negative, a little bit losing, so you go through those learning lessons. But I made money on that one. So, other than that, If we go into the second week, specifically on this day, I guess these days really didn't have much to it because I got a lot of small wins and losses. This is where the ultimate kind of potential disaster comes in. And I think most of you probably know what ticker we're talking about here, which is RETO. So RETO here, and we're talking specifically right here, early August. Just a really choppy and tricky kind of China scam. For those who've been following China scams for the last 2 or 3 years, they've become increasingly more difficult. Last year, they were fairly straightforward, and then as the later in the year it went into 2022, they got more difficult. Now we're in 2023, and they're probably the most difficult they've ever been, in my opinion, to the point which I'll talk about in the next few minutes about me even debating of even whether I should be trading them or not. But to go into the details of what actually happened here, I don't know if I have the daily or the intraday loaded. I'm going to have to do custom. Yeah, we don't here. Let's go back real quick. We are talking about this day here, which is August 3rd. This is where it all started, okay? Go here, September, August 3rd. So huge squeeze, just massive squeeze. And this was one of the first kind of attempts or moves we saw from this. We precedingly saw many more types of this kind of play go into CLU, go into HKIT, all these other scams that are out there. There's this new kind of playbook where they will bring in a lot of volume, right? There's clearly a lot, but it's just going to stay sideways. It's not really going to go anywhere. And eventually they let go of the ask, and anyone who's short just gets absolutely their pants ripped off, right? Just totally squeezed. Me being one of them on this play. If we go, let's get rid of TUP, RETO, this one right here. So huge squeeze. Again, I'm getting short right into what I see this volume, and all of a sudden just bam, right? Huge slippage, way oversized, or for I guess not slippage, not way oversized, but like way over, I guess just slippage range and where I thought I'd actually get out. Quite nuts. I end up now start chopping myself around, reshorting, covering, then try to scale in, and then I hold this overnight. Ultimately leading into the next day, which was this fake dump. Again, if we go here, if we go to the 4th, this dump and then huge recovery. And again, I'm at this point biased. I'm at this point kind of tilted. And here we are on this trade as well. Right? I'm adding to my short. I'm then covering. I'm adding again, then covering again. I had like one more small piece on. Ultimately ended up covering that last small piece like as we started uptrending. I thought to myself, if like this can hold this high, and we just roll over, it's possible. But once we started breaking out on this day over this like tight range at $3, I covered the rest and then just ate the loss, ultimately losing $42,000. So between all the plays, I mean, you saw about 3 or 4 attempts there, whether it be just scaling in or those fake dumps. Call it 10 to 20K per attempt, let's call it. Ended up a way bigger loss than I wanted. Again, had it been a little bit higher, a little bit more, I would have just stopped myself out, or I would have been my max loss. It would have ended right there. So it's unfortunate. It is what it is. It's the amount of money I'm willing to risk on some of these plays. But again, I'm upset with it because it clearly wasn't the play to risk that much on. Right? I kind of knew in the back of my head that the edge and how they move and how they work this time around, or this kind of, I guess, this period in the cycle of these things, the edge isn't there anymore. Right? It's just not nearly as good as it once was. And unfortunately, part of me didn't want to accept that. It's like I knew it, but I didn't want to accept it. And so that's why I kept trading it like I did. Again, ultimately led to too many losses. And that wasn't all, right? It continued, right? After this week and then into the next week, this $30,000 day was also RETO. I still hadn't fully accepted, what was going on. Even though, again, back in the back of my head, I'm like, you know what? This is not the same thing. And unfortunately, the good part is that this is eventually what led me to realize, like, you need to stop, or I need to trade these massively differently, because the dangers that they can bring into this kind of thing allowed me to see the fact that, a lot of these, if they're going to play them and move them this way, they're just not worth trading, period. And what do I mean by that? If we look at my actual trades here to show you how insane this was, and I talked about this in a very in-depth video lesson for 4Leaf Clover subscribers. So if you haven't watched that, go ahead and watch that if you're part of 4Leaf. But essentially, got short again, chasing the volume. Just pure FOMO at this point, really. This is not much else besides FOMO. Cover it, re-short it again, 2 to FOMO, and then I halted up on super low volume, and then they gap it up massively. this is what opened my eyes to the fact that when these promoters or whoever they are have this much liquidity, have this much power and control over these kind of scams, and they halt it up like this, they can kind of, with enough money, push it wherever they want. And for those who were in this halt, or were watching it at least, I mean, at first it halted up on very little volume. It was indicating 4, then indicating 450, then indicating 475, then over 5, then over 550. And before you know it, after being halted like an hour plus, it's indicating 6. And again, my stop loss, or where I would like to stop out, was going to be like the high 3s, or if not, at worst case, just over $4, the high a day. But what happens when they gap it up over those levels? Immensely. Excuse me. You have no control over that. Like, it doesn't matter if you have a stop loss. Doesn't matter if you have a max broker stop, right? Whatever stop loss you have, you think that's going to protect you. If a stock gaps up like this, there's nothing you can do. Zero. And who's stopping these guys from halting it up 5, 10, 15, $20 a share, right? If they really wanted to, of course, they would be putting a lot of their money on the line. But again, they have tons of money. Who is stopping them from gapping it up to $10 a share in this scenario? Halting it in the mid-5s or mid-3s, forgive me, and then gapping it up over 200-300%, right? No stop loss, no max broker stop is going to prevent you from that kind of a loss. And so this is what the first realization for me that happened. And so then I cut it immediately out the when we halted, or reopened and then halted down. And of course, in hindsight, you can say, oh, well, it halted down and then gapped down huge, and you could have got out here. It's like, that's the biggest problem. And I'm so happy I cut it, because too many times they could halt it down and then do the same thing, and they could just gap it up, right? If you've traded low floats or any things that are manipulated, you've seen them before where a stock can halt down but then actually gap up. And so I knew immediately I had to get out ASAP once this resumed. And I lost 30 grand more. And unfortunately, because I would have only wanted to lose like 10 grand. Had I cut it here or here, it would have been like 10 to 15 max. And unfortunately, my loss well over doubled, like easily over doubled. And so that was one of the realizations of like, this edge, this play, this kind of setup is just not the same anymore. And the safest solution would be stop trading it. Now, granted, I did end up trading it one more time when it actually finally died. And I think that's what keeps me coming back, is that eventually it does die. But again, it's easy to say, oh, eventually I made money. It's fine. The reality is I still didn't make money. I made a little bit back here. I made like 20 grand back. But the reality is, after taking a 40 grand loss and 30 grand loss, I'm down 70 grand. And then after a 20 grand profit, I'm still down 50 grand. So like, this month for me would have been insanely better had I just not traded it, right? And so that's why I'm still deeply and most likely contemplating on just not trading them. Or if I do trade them, I need to trade them very small size. Like, it's almost to the point where I question, why would I trade them in the first place ever? So I'm still trying to mentally battle that, how I want to go about it. But it's just not what it was, right? Granted, it finally died. Like I said, that's how they usually go. But again, how you go about it, or how they decide to play games on the way up, is a huge factor to this. And so again, like, just to hypothetically play it out, had I delete that day, delete this day, and then that's when I made my money back on the 24th, it's like, I'm having a 68K month. Like, you tell me, would you rather have a 68K month and not trade these scams, or trade these scams and then risk losing an insane amount of money? That's just not worth it, right? And so a big part of me really, really needs to be either extremely picky, if not trade them at all, to try to handle and navigate the market. Because they're very easy. They really tie into your strings of FOMO. Like, I've got a lot of questions from students and people who trade them of like, what do I do about it? And I'm like, guys, like, you just got to have the discipline, not trade them. In many, many ways. And again, I know it's easier said than done, because again, I have the same issues of like, do I trade it? Do I not trade it? But again, when you look at the P&L, the ultimate goal here is to make money. So if you're trading these things and losing money, it's like any other setup. It shouldn't be treated any differently. So that's really my spiel on this one. Unfortunately, it is what it is. But again, at this point, after I take it, before I had made some money back here, and once I took these losses, I pretty much accepted the fact that I was going to end the month red. I was totally okay with it. I wasn't going to just give up. I was going to keep trading like I normally do, but trade on my edge. But I was pretty much, at that point, accepting that this month might be red and have 2 red months in a row, which is, again, totally fine. but I just had accepted. I already mentally prepared myself, given that when you take big losses like this, your chance of being profitable will go down drastically, like immensely. And ultimately, because of these big losses, I realized what made these stats so bad, right? This huge slippage day, turned my average loss from like sub 10% to 15 because it's lost nearly 70, 80% on a gap up. On top of that, the big losses just made my average loss bigger than my average gain, which I think without the big losses, it should have been much, much lower. They would have been like and my average loss being like $4 or $3 grand. On top of the fact, then, my biggest gain and then biggest loss is way off, as well as my percentages. Again, this was the gap up, 88%. Win rate is okay, but again, I've had really good months even with this kind of a win rate. So I'm babbling on here, but you get the point. And so moving on, and what ended up made me realize that I actually might end green was that even though this week I took this 30K loss, this week in general was a really good trading week. And so why was that? Because of TTOO. An incredible runner, amazing breakout for those who were part of this breakout over the 18-cent level and then all the way up to 45 on this day. Just an incredible move, 2-day move. And so I think a lot of people were anticipating the next breakout, including myself. And so once it happened, it was on like Donkey Kong, right? This breakout ended up being beautiful. One of the more easier, stronger breakouts that we've seen in a very long time. And then but what I mean by easy is the fact that if you bought the breakout price after the market opened, you almost were never down. it worked immediately. And I was someone who bought it. So the breakout level is 45. It was consolidating between this called 25 and 40 for a long time. It ends up gapping up into that 45 level. In fact, pre-market, it ends up being over 45, right? It actually goes over to like 47-ish, 48-ish. Now, granted, some of you might be thinking, well, if it broke out pre-market, I should buy it. Not me. I am very patient. I do not want to buy early. In fact, I'd rather be super late. And so I had zero interest buying out the open here. I was like, if it's going to work, then so be it. I'll just buy it at a later price when there's a better consolidation. I am not going to chase this out the open. It ends up actually holding 45 perfectly and then sells off all the way down to 41. Now, granted, I had thought this was going to fail and shop around lower and then consolidate and then maybe in a couple of days come back. However, when it came back, not in a couple of days, but in a couple of minutes, call it from the low day of 9:45, and then actually ended up breaking high day at 9:59, call it, or 10 o'clock, 30 minutes in, I had realized this was the little dip they needed, and they're actually going to break it out. And so instead of waiting a couple of days, I was like, you know what? Nope. They've respected that breakout level out the open. And now after just a nice little dip to shake some longs out, they're actually going to break it out. And so I said, yep, we're going to buy it. I pretty much bought it at 45. I was going to risk 41. Unfortunately, never added. I believe I never added if I have the chart here. Actually, I did add. I added late day once it actually started holding. Even though this is not a great ad, I would have loved adding lower, much lower. But again, I kind of took the approach of like, you know what, I've got my position and let's just let it run. I remember not even watching it like most of this midday. I had an eye on it to see if it was going to fade and fall off, but like as long as it kept holding levels, I just really stopped watching it. And then eventually, like I said, I bought it into this dip late day here, knowing that now this is a breakout, the first day of the breakout. It's clearly significantly holding. It's holding every level it's made or every new low of consolidation it's made. And then by after hours, it just really started going. I ended up selling. Let's make this bigger so you guys can see. Ended up selling a bit more in after hours. Sold some more into the morning spike here, and then ended up selling the rest when it started dying. In hindsight, or I guess in pre-sight, I should say, before this happened, I thought this was going to go much higher. I had thought, great, we're gapping up, maybe a little bit a week of a shakeout pre-market, but I thought, you know what, I think the plan was we're going to hold and then spike our way to like 80 and have like $1 be a magnet in my ideal world, in my ideal kind of scenario, right? But then I realized once it was holding 70 really harshly, and then pretty much was holding in after hours price action and then couldn't even get above pre-market highs here, that's why you see me selling a piece there, right? I exited out, but the circle, I sold a little bit here because I'm like, you know what? If it doesn't break over 70 and 70 is the high, I should probably take some off. So I sold some more. And then once we started breaking down and making lower lows below 64 here, this last low, I sold it all. And then I immediately actually flipped short, mainly because I just knew in the back of my head, I'm like, yeah, I wanted to go higher, but by all means, it doesn't have to, right? And the reality is we're up from 30 to 60 close. We're gapping up to 65, 70. We're up over 100%. And the reality is this only had a 2-day move in the previous breakout and then still died. It actually wicked super hard, and then the next day was a red day. So there's no stopping this from having also wicking super hard. So I thought at the minimum, this could easily wick. And if it wicks, it's going to gap down, right? I was kind of playing these futuristic events in my head. And so I thought to myself, no, I'm not going to give gains back. It's not worth that. So that's why you did see me sell it all at 64. And then I immediately got aggressive. I said, you know what? Well, if it's going to wick and it's going to hold down, let's just get short and see how it goes. With the risk on 70. And so if we look at my trades here on TTOO, it ended up working out way better than I expected. Getting short right when I sold my long, panicked red-green, panicked some more to red, so I covered the rest, and then the floodgates just opened. This was very similar to TRKA for those who were a part of that trade, because I think it was back in March of this year, of 2023. Same idea, like the same exact action where this lower-priced sub-dollar stock ended up having a panic of a red day way further than everyone expected. And so I unfortunately covered super early in hindsight, right? I'm still happy with how I traded it, but like once I covered and then it, whoever was left to sell, really just opened the range massively. I ended up actually dip buying it, very small size, and then flipping it at like 50 cents. Ended up reshorting it, covering that, reshorting again, covering there. So I ended up making 14 grand on the total long and dip buy. I made like a couple hundred more on the dip buy. So really the 14 grand was mainly that longs, end up selling it all at 64. And then between all this short and then the two bounce shorts, I ended up making 14 grand total. So 14 grand long, 14 grand short, 28K total on this trade. On top of the fact that even after that, I actually started shorting it on some bounce days. I believe I made some money shorting this bounce and covering into this wash. I think I made money one more time. I don't remember exactly where. I think I missed this pullback. Maybe it was this day. I'm not really sure. But the point is, this runner really brought life to the small cap market, which again explains a lot of these really great days that I had. On top of the fact, because it was running here, they brought a lot of sympathies. TVIC being one of them. Now, it was any stock that had it was under $1 at the time. Again, this has done a reverse split. Actually, did a reverse split, I think, a couple days ago. So ignore this. This was actually, I believe, like below 10 cents, if I'm not mistaken. And so a huge strong grain day. I took it overnight, and we got a huge gap up, right? If we look at the trade here, less than 10 cents. So they had a huge reverse split. We're trading around 5 to 6 cents. I ended up buying it into the close because I thought to myself, all of these. This is about a day or two after TTO, but at that time the momentum was still there. A lot of, again, NVOS was one, eBet was another one. There was all these lower priced stocks that were just having momentum simply because TTO was one that had started at, call it 10, 20 cents, and made it all the way up to 70. So everyone wants to catch the next big runner. And so I did end up buying it. I ended up buying it a little bit early and then selling it. But then it held up, so I rebought in the close. Next day, it gaps up huge. I sell at the open. I made $6 grand here. So a really great sympathy play there. Unfortunately, never did much else, right? Obviously, after this gap up day, it died and then has faded ever since. But really, that momentum really brought my week back. So even losing 30 grand on RETO, I still ended up being up 30 grand on the week. So a really great week. And this kind of gave me some, I guess, light at the end of the tunnel that like, oh my gosh, we actually might be green at the end of the month. Considering after this and borrow fees at the time, I was like just barely break even, if down a couple grand. And so then once we hit the next week, and then I made some money on RETO, like we talked about, I was green. So like, okay, great. I don't mind if we close red. It's fine. Like I've accepted it, but I guess it's a little bit nice that I've recovered, and we'll close a little bit of green. Now, in terms of the last week here, specifically trading in front of or live trading with all the bootcamp goers in Boston. The main play for me was VFS. It's funny, we kept calling it VHS because it's VHS like cassette tapes. They're out of business, and we were like joking that this company's way overvalued, which they were. But they're going to go out of business. They're not going to. They're clearly still a stock. They just IPO'd or just became a stock, right? But instead of VFS, I had taken a couple losses on the top day, getting squeezed out. It was very thin, very kind of sketchy and scary by how it moved. And I know a lot of short sellers, not only including myself, really got chopped up this day. And again, a lot of the bootcamp goers saw us really break this down, thinking we thought it was going to die. The fact that it kept, squeezing and then stuffing. But then ultimately, at some point, once it keeps holding and then keeps squeezing some more, eventually you have to flip from it's going to die to actually no, it's not. And then we ended up taking losses. Me and Jack specifically, and I think Huddy was short too. Huddy took some losses on this day. So I lost I think 3 or 4 grand, maybe actually more like 5 or 6, if I remember correctly. But the thing is, and then something we've noticed, if you haven't noticed this pattern on the days we've been trading or the previous stocks we've been trading, TUP, wick day, huge gap down. TTOO, let's go to this daily chart. From the first breakout, we go over here, went a little too far back, right? Wick day, gap down, red day, right? And so this was the trend I had been seeing this month. And I thought to myself, you know what, if this can wick, right? If we go to the daily chart, if this ends up holding itself and closing red, like a red candle, I know it's still green in the day, but it closed like a red wick candle, being this overvalued, I mean, I think it was worth like 150 billion, like something ridiculous. If this can wick like this, we are seeing a trend this month that leads to actually the backside. Like that actually leads to the top, right? So once we did that, I realized I want to short overnight. And if we go to our trades here, or my trades, this was RETO, the finally day it died. Sorry, I skipped over this, but finally actually got short once it started like not halting, because again, I didn't want to get caught in a halt. I'd started in on a halt, but I was really scared here that they were just going to gap it up, which they could have. But finally, once they stopped halting, I then just let them fade it off. But again, I was watching like a hawk. I was like, the moment they halt this up, I am looking to cover. Not, again, very, very scary. Part of me regrets not even taking this because, again, I'm still mentally battling whether I should trade it or not. But here's the chart anyway. So there you go. You see that. But anyway, VFS, if you go over here. So again, got short into like the morning weakness. Wasn't really happy with these entries, but I also was really scared getting short into the spike because it was just so thin for those who saw how we traded it. And then covered it into this kind of spike move up. Avoided the rest of the day. Once we came back and really, and part of the thinking was the fact that because this only squeezed to like 92, I would have thought it would have squeezed much higher. Like if there were a lot of shorts left caught in this thing, I think this should have easily gone over 100. And so the fact that we didn't, the fact that we only broke highs by like a few dollars a share, and then only to come right back down and then actually double bottom at like these like high 40s, or not high 40s, high 70s, and then bounce right back. I'm like, I want to get short into the bounce and hold overnight, especially if it holds below this like mid 80s and then has like a wick red candle. And that's what I did. I held it overnight. Next day, we get on a gap down, which is great. The biggest mistake I think I made here is that I did not add here. I wanted to add if it spiked to like the 77, 78, maybe even 80, and then risking red green or the previous like bounce highs of like this 85 level. But I just never did. I don't know if I was too focused on like live trading with the people there. I don't know if main part is it was so scary yesterday that the last thing I want to do was get oversized or too big a size and then feel like I need to stop out emotionally. But the reality is this was an incredible ad. Even if you didn't want to add the weak morning spike here, letting it bounce out and then make a lower high and then re-shorting once it failed and then watching this slowly trickle down. I mean, that was one of the safer ads you could ever have. Like shorting overnight was a bit risky because this still could have gapped up and gone higher. But if you wanted to play the safest way possible, shorting this into this bounce or risking the high day here, was incredible because you would have, even after that, you still never saw those prices ever again. To this day, days later, you saw 70s for maybe a few more minutes, and that was the last time you're going to see 70s. So eventually with the smaller size I did have overnight, I did end up covering it, right? I covered it into the like 60, high 50s range. But again, I'm a bit frustrated with this one because I almost got too scared out on how choppy the top day was that I forgot how weak the backside could be. Because again, this was an immensely overvalued stock, like $100 billion, $150 billion stock up top here. And this reminds me immensely of REVN, which was also an automobile company. Again, Rivian's a little bit more legit than this one, but when it IPO'd, it was the same thing. It was like worth like 150 billion plus. Same idea where it just ran a few days in a row and then just nothing but fade, right? If you just timed the back end and then swung it, you would have been up immensely. And so when I didn't do that with VFS, I just questioned like, why not? Like, why didn't I? Because had you swung even for a couple more days, you're down well over 50% off the highs. More than that, like 60 or 70% off the highs. It would have been a huge, huge win. So unfortunately, I only made it into making like $4,000 or so on this trade total after the losses. But I can't help but think, like, man, if you had just been a little bit more aggressive, a little more conscious of a better risk level, and then on top of that had some patience to swing it a bit, or even reshort it. Like, not even have to swing it, but just reshort every day, risking the highs. It could have led to a lot more. But unfortunately it wasn't, so that's that. The other last trade of the month here was GBTC. GBTC had a lawsuit ongoing with the SEC because the SEC wouldn't approve them as a spot ETF, which essentially would uplist them to the NASDAQ off of the OTC market. News came out that finally they actually won their lawsuit, so now the SEC kind of has to approve them. But the problem is GBTC is now in line with the other, call it 7 or 8 other companies that want to put out a spot ETF for Bitcoin. So they kind of just got put in line. Unfortunately, I missed most of the spike action of buying it in the 20s, and then took it overnight and then sold for a loss once it kind of gapped down and then continued its momentum. Had it officially turned into an ETF right away, I mean, this thing would have gone to 22, 23, 24, right? That's kind of was my thesis at the time. But because they won their lawsuit and now are just in line to get approved, that kind of killed the momentum. And as you can see, it actually has pretty much lost its gains almost entirely. Even Bitcoin itself lost any spiking gains it had as well. Mainly because, like, yeah, it's great news, but the actual news they want, which is to just get approved as an ETF, is still yet to come, right? The SEC still has to approve that. Now, granted, them winning the lawsuit pretty much guarantees they'll get approved. They'll approve it, but there's still some time risk in terms of how long that'll take, because it could be a few months, and you have no idea what Bitcoin's going to do in the next few months, which makes sense as to why it didn't continue its move. So lost like 3 or 4 grand on that one, and then end of the month up about just under 22 grand. The great part is I'm already up that about same amount coming into Friday. We had a great play on ICCT, which I will talk about come next month. But just a really great play. Trade this really well. Very happy how he traded it. But again, led to me to making about 20 grand on it, and pretty much putting myself already at the same month in terms of profit-wise, and it's only been 1 day in. So great to see, hopefully, and makes me feel better that September will be a much better month. But anyways, guys, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys after September. Peace.